Good evening and welcome everybody to the 28th talk in these Great Mind, Great Lives Virtual Fireside University of Buckingham evening talks to set your evening off and the weekend tomorrow off with a real sparkle and real stimulation. Tonight we have Chris Wilkins, Head of Strategy at Downing Street under Theresa May, and anyone who thinks that people do not have experience before they go into these high-powered jobs in politics, Chris is the person to show how wrong that is. Chris had probably a couple of days between leaving university and briefing the leader of the opposition. So if that doesn't give you time, those 48 hours to get a wealth of experience before going to the very top of politics, then what possibly could? So today, Chris is going to give a illustrated talk on the theme of Theresa to Boris, bearing in mind that it's Boris Johnson's first anniversary and the first anniversary since Theresa May stood down just next week. And that will last some 20 minutes. Then I'll ask Chris some questions coming out of that, and then over to your questions. If you have never been on this before, please can I invite you to write questions. Short questions are much preferred, if that's all right. Do put your name. Love to mention your name. If you want to mention an affiliation, put that in too. If you enjoy the series, do send the list of the speakers out to everybody, you know, all your friends. This is just a public service outreach from the university, and we're reaching as many as possible. We have over 1,000 already listening to this. I expect to go up towards 2,000. Chris, if you do a good job, that is. Chris Wilkins, welcome. Very nice to have you with us tonight. And Chris, can you just begin, as we always begin, by describing your room? Because we can see inside your room. We couldn't if this was a talk on a stage. Where are you, Chris?
Where am I? Well, I'm actually sitting in my office. I've sent everyone else away. So I'm in my office on St. Martin's Lane, just off Trafalgar Square in London.
And give us a dispatch from central London. What's it like? Is it crowded with people on the streets?
Well, as I look out of the window, I can tell you, I feel like I'm the only person in central London. There is nobody around. My office is directly opposite the Colosseum, which is home to the English National Opera, and that's all shuttered. There's the tape has been distributed across it saying live theatre closed, live theatre missing, which is a sad sight. And it's really, really quiet. I was wandering down Whitehall earlier today, and again, it felt like it was just me. So it's quite surreal in London at the moment.
And well, here you are talking to almost as large a number as can fit in to the Colosseum, and actually probably larger now. And Chris, very, very warm welcome from all of us, and thank you very much for being our guest tonight.
Well, thank you, Anthony. Well, good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you and to be part of this series of august talks that you have going on. And this evening, as Anthony said, I'd like to talk initially and share some slides with you and some photos, and then happy to take questions. And the theme really of tonight is sort of slightly twofold. Firstly, it's to talk about what life in Number 10 is like from my perspective, from my time there, but really to link from Theresa to Boris and try and draw some lessons from the two. And that's quite a broad theme, so I'll do my best. And I have to say that trying to talk about what life in Number 10 is like on a call with Anthony Selden feels to me a little like trying to describe the beginnings of the internet to Tim Berners-Lee, but I will do my best to share some insights and some, I hope, interesting background to life there. So just thinking about how we link the Theresa and Boris stories, I was thinking that really the subtext of this whole presentation and conversation this evening comes down to, for me, to this quote, a famous quote from The Art of War, that strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And I'll come back to that at the end. But my role in Number 10 between 2016 and 2017 was twofold. As well as being chief speechwriter to the Prime Minister, I was also director of strategy. And really, as you'll see as we go through the talk, the job in Number 10 of trying to stick to a coherent long-term strategy, to keep your sights set on that sort of end goal, is really, really difficult. And so someone in my role is there to try and keep the whole building and the whole government focused on that, and not let them be distracted by the day-to-day noises off and the day-to-day pressures that come along. And in Number 10, that is very, very difficult, because it literally at times feels like a bunker. And certainly in, I think, the later part of Theresa May's premiership, that's what it became for her and for the team there, slightly happily from my point of view, just after I had left. So we'll come back to strategy in a bit. As Anthony said, just to give you a quick bit about me, I have over the years worked for all of these 5 leaders of the Conservative Party, starting with William Hague in 2000. As Anthony referenced, I left university on the Friday, and on the Wednesday I was briefing him for Prime Minister's questions as leader of the opposition. So it was a bit of a baptism of fire. And I've been in and around Westminster and the Conservative Party for on and off 20 years, working for all of the individuals here. And my first boss in politics back in 2000 was in fact this lady, Anne Widdecombe, and my first job and heavy responsibility was to buy Anne's bacon sandwiches every morning from the local cafe, and woe betide me if I got the order wrong. But my first lesson in politics was that there is you have to start at the bottom. There's no job too small. But having done that and having worked for all these leaders over time, it was some 16 years later that I found myself no longer buying bacon sandwiches in the local cafe, but in an office that adjoins this room in Number 10. For somebody who'd come from my background, I never imagined I would have the opportunity to work in Downing Street. But I'd known Theresa May since her days as party chair in the early 2000s, when I had written speeches for her then, and I perhaps one of the most prominent was the speech which became known as the Nasty Party speech, which she made as chairman when she challenged the Conservative Party that it needed to change. And we'd kept in touch over the years since. And when she was elected Prime Minister, leader of the party and Prime Minister in July of 2016, I was by this time working in the private sector, thinking that I had finally left politics behind me. And one Sunday morning, my phone rang. It was my old friend Nick Timothy, who by this point had been appointed the Joint Chief of Staff in Downing Street. And as I picked up the phone, I looked at it and then I said to my wife, "It's Nick." And she said, "Oh no," because she knew what was about to happen. And half an hour later, he described a role to me which was simply too good to say no to. So as I put the phone down, I didn't even have to tell my wife that at that point I was jacking in my private sector job and going to work back in politics and in Number 10, because when you're given that opportunity, you don't say no. So it was that I found myself in a small office adjoining the cabinet room, which lies at the centre of Downing Street. And just to give you a sense of this room, for those who've not seen photos before or been there, this is obviously where the cabinet meets, but it's also where the cabinet subcommittee meets and things like the National Security Council meet as well. It's where The Prime Minister appoints their cabinet. Sitting in the chair here, you can see just on the right of the picture, a chair pulled back, which is the only chair around the table that actually has arms on it, and that's the Prime Minister's chair. No one else is allowed to sit in that. And they sit there, and one by one, their new cabinet comes in and sits opposite them and is appointed to the cabinet at that point, one of the first things that Theresa had to do. And just to give you a sense of the geography as well, if you look at the end of this photo, you'll see just two white double doors, and on the other side of those double doors is the Prime Minister's study, which is this room here. And Theresa, when she took over as Prime Minister, had the table and chairs there put back in quite deliberately. Before that, it was a series of sofas and soft seating. She had that put back in to show that this was different, that the sort of David Cameron era of sofa government was over, and that she was going to have a different style, that cabinet government was back, and that this was somewhat, as I think she liked to think of it, more sort of slightly more grown up and serious. And in number 10, when you're a staff like me, your day starts with a meeting around that cabinet table at about 8 o'clock in the morning, and you gather to consider what the day's topics are, what's in the news, what are the big issues that you're going to face that day, and what decisions need to be taken. And then at 8:30, a smaller group moves into the Prime Minister's study here to sit around the table and effectively repeat the conversation with them and take their responses to some of the big questions that you need to ask them. Now, it's worth noting as well that unlike, say, in the US, where we have the Oval Office, and that's the permanent office of the President of the United States, the Prime Minister is at liberty in Downing Street to choose their own study, their own office. This was the office that David Cameron chose, and Theresa May kept the same room. Boris Johnson is also residing in this office. But John Major, for example, used to work from the cabinet table. Gordon Brown chose an office down the other end of the building, closer to what is now the press office. And Margaret Thatcher, when she was Prime Minister, used to work from a room on the first floor above this room, and what's now become known as the Thatcher study. But this was where we used to gather every morning around that table to discuss the issues of the day, and where we would also gather then subsequently to discuss all of the various meetings and policy issues that we had to address, and I'll come back to those in a moment. I'm just very quickly going to give you a little whistle-stop tour of the rest of the House as well, or some of the other key buildings, before going back to the substance of what I wanted to say, just to give you an insight. As a staffer, there aren't really meeting rooms as such as you would imagine them to go to, so you end up holding meetings in some quite sort of interesting places. This is the pillared room on the first floor of Downing Street, very ornate and rather large, and occasionally you'd end up in meetings in here with 3 or 4 of you in this rather massive room, and it's a slightly surreal, wondering what you're doing there. If you look through the doors there, that's the terracotta room, which is just slightly smaller, and another place where meetings take place. And then further beyond that, to the doors you see there, is the white room, and that's a small room such as this, which is typically where you would see the Prime Minister hosting heads of state, and in this case John Kerry, who was Secretary of State in the United States at the time, and this is where foreign dignitaries are often received. This is the Thatcher room that I talked about, and I'll come back to that a bit later as well, where Margaret Thatcher had her office again on the first floor, and sort of slightly famously in the folklore of Downing Street, when she left number 10, she had a small figurine of a Thatcher built into the ceiling here, so that there would always be a Thatcher in number 10 even after she had left, which is something, when you take people around number 10, you spend ages trying to get them to sort of find the Thatcher in the ceiling. If you find yourself in this room as a staffer, then you know that your meeting is too big. This is the state dining room that seats about 50 people. So on occasion used for big state banquets and things like that, particularly we had, for example, the President of France and things like that to come and have dinner here. But by day, it's just a meeting room like any other, and you find yourself on this rather ornate table discussing some very prosaic policy issues. And then the final thing, just to give you the completed tour, is that we've all seen these press conferences recently, and this really is just the other angle of the state dining room. They clear out all the furniture, they open the doors, and that's where we currently host our press conferences. And as you may have seen in the media, Number 10 have just announced the intention to move to these televised press conferences, US style televised press conferences, and they are in the process of building a whole new suite in the adjoining building of Number 9 Downing Street to accommodate that. So before the end of the year, we'll see the first of our new US style televised lobby briefings, which is causing great excitement amongst the members of the press, I can tell you. So that's the whistle-stop tour of the actual building. Just to give you a sense, though, of how the day works in Number 10, as I said, you start with that 8 o'clock meeting and then an 8:30 meeting, and then what really happens is you end up in a succession of meetings throughout the day. Certainly when you're in my role, you spend a lot of time in the Prime Minister's study talking about the different policy issues that cross their desk. And I think what people don't always appreciate is quite how diverse those issues can be. I remember towards the end of Theresa May's time in office, people would often comment on what incredible resilience she had and how she could cope with all the machinations of Brexit and the parliamentary party. And I would think, well, that's absolutely true. But at the same time, what people don't see is that alongside all that, she's still having the meetings about all the other areas of policy that matter, because decisions have to be made and they can't wait. So they still have to have those. She would still every evening attend 2, maybe 3 charitable functions in Downing Street and elsewhere. And that was something that Theresa in particular was always loath to cancel any of those, because she'd made commitments to charities and she wanted to keep them. So whatever you see from the outside about what the Prime Minister does, the actual day job is 3-4 times that. And people don't always see quite how much work goes into it. It really is relentless. Theresa used to stay up until 1 o'clock or so completing her red boxes, and then she'd be back in meetings 8:30 the next morning every day. It's a relentless task, and the stamina required is quite remarkable. I'm showing you these 2 documents because Downing Street is still quite analog in many ways, and it relies on, or sort of depends on, a few key documents. And on the one side of the screen here, you can see what is the Downing Street grid, which is the document that Alistair Campbell brought in when he was Director of Communications to coordinate the government's policy announcements. And this has taken on sort of some it's a bit of a fabled document now. It's taken on a bit of its life, its own. People talk of it as this incredibly secretive and clever thing. In reality, it's pretty much a diary about what the government is doing from day to day, and it's not as exciting as is often regarded. But just to give you a sense of that, that's a document that you would consult every morning to see, what are the key things on the agenda today, and what are we focusing on. And on the other side of the screen, just to give you a sense of that, again, Downing Street operates in a very analog way. The Prime Minister has a red box full of printed out policy papers and proposals and briefing notes that they have to consider, and they respond to those by writing, as Theresa has here on the front page, in the comment box, what their response is. That goes back into the system, and then the paper comes back around again. So it's not exactly a high-tech digital functioning thing, but the system works, and it's important. And documents like this are particularly important when people like Sir Anthony write their histories of prime ministers and things like that, because it's things like these that they consult. So we are resisting moving everything online or digital because the processes work, and it's important to have the historical record. But it's sometimes interesting to think how, I guess, compared to some of the corporate world, it can be occasionally a bit clunky.
Chris, before you leave that, let's go back to that slide.
Indeed.
And just tell us about the slide on the right-hand side, and tell us who Jojo is in line 2, and Jojo Penn and what she did. And also, can you explain what the red box was? We saw the red box. I don't know whether we can go back to it, about 3 slides ago, when She was in the Thatcher room. There we are.
Yes.
Just tell everyone what the Prime Minister's red box is.
Of course, yes, absolutely. So the red box that you see here, every Secretary of State will have one of these, but the Prime Minister in particular sometimes more than one. At the end of every day, the civil service team will pack the red box full of all of the policy submissions and briefing notes and speeches maybe that someone like I have written, and all of the things that the Prime Minister needs to consider overnight and report back on the next day. So it's effectively the Prime Minister's homework, which is handed to them as they maybe leave the office about 8 o'clock in the evening, and the civil service will expect to receive that back the next morning, fully annotated and with clear instructions on every paper that goes in there. So it's quite a rapid turnaround, and that's the process that we go through. So that's what Teresa would often stay up until 1 o'clock in the morning working on, to make sure that she had diligently answered every query the civil service had before the next morning. And then just to take you back to this, and I say this here is an example of what that looks like. So behind here would be a sort of 8, 9, 10 page briefing note. On this one, it's on what was the integration strategy at the time from February of 2017. And here Teresa's answered her with her comments. She received notes that said, we recommend this course of action. Then a whole note that lays out all of the facts behind it and justifying why the civil service wanted to recommend that approach. Here the Prime Minister is slightly disagreeing and agreeing, as you say, Anthony, with Jojo Penn, who was the Deputy Chief of Staff in Downing Street throughout Teresa's time in office, now Baroness Penn, indeed. And Jojo had worked with the Prime Minister when they were at the Home Office together as well. So there were two Chiefs of Staff, Fiona Hill and Nick Timothy, who I worked very closely with, and Jojo was the Deputy Chief of Staff. And really, I guess the four of us became a bit of a team. And as I'll come to slightly fatefully, it was the four of us who went up to the Prime Minister's residence, which is actually number 11 Downing Street, the apartment, in March of 2017, to put our case to call a snap general election. I will come back to that issue in a moment.
Not your best idea, Chris.
Well, as I would say, Anthony, it was still the right idea. It was just very badly executed.
No, and absolutely rightly too.
Okay. Shall I?
Yeah.
I'd like to just talk you through a few sort of particular incidents, I suppose, or moments in my time in Number 10, which illustrate the point I made at the start about how difficult it is to really stick to a strategic focus in Downing Street. And here you see a picture from a conference, the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham in October of 2016. So we'd not been in office long. We were immediately faced with having to go to Birmingham and make the Prime Minister's big speech, as they always do, on the final day of conference. And here we are in the Prime Minister's hotel room in Birmingham, finishing the drafting process. I'm sorry that it's not a great image because of the watermark. But we spent an awful lot of time working on this speech, hours, days beforehand, before going to conference, hours at conference, crafting, shaping, editing. A speech for a Prime Minister or a party leader at a party conference, it amounts to about 7,000 words or so, 7,500 words. And it's it's our equivalent, I suppose, of a State of the Union address. So it's a big deal. And we had here a big idea of a strategy, and the speech was entitled "The Good That Government Can Do." It was intended to signal a change of approach, that we'd come out of the referendum result when people had really rebelled against the status quo and asked for things to change. And Teresa here was going to signal a change in the fact that actually government is a good thing, and it needs to be a bit more interventionist and help people a bit more than maybe it had done in the years before. And that was the plan, and that was what we went in with. But of course, much as I would defend the speech and think it had lots of good in it. It really became known for one line, which was a line that said, if you're a citizen, if you believe you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere, which was a line that became effectively the headline and really defined the text as a whole. And yet it was a line that had sort of snuck in unnoticed, wasn't a deliberate part of the strategy, and really was just linking one bit of the text to another. And it was a lesson, I suppose, for us in how careful you have to be about language and things like that, because however grand your strategic ideas, it's very easy to be knocked off course when something like that happens. The other thing that happened at this conference, of course, was that the Prime Minister stood up on the Sunday at the start of conference and made a speech about Brexit. And subsequently, this was seen as the moment she laid out her red lines on her Brexit negotiation. And again, I think the interesting thing about that is that that stemmed from a tactical decision, which was that she was a new party leader and a new Prime Minister going into a conference. She hadn't been elected by the members in the country of the Conservative Party because there'd not been a contest. And so she really needed to say something on day one of the conference to take ownership of that. And in doing that, the only thing she could talk about was Brexit. So we made a tactical decision for her to make that speech. It wasn't intended to be a big strategic intervention in the Brexit debate, and yet subsequently that's what it was seen to be. And I think, again, an interesting lesson in how tactics can undermine strategic thinking at times. And I think that sometimes somewhat brings us up to date with Boris Johnson, which I'll come to in a moment. In January of 2017, I just wanted to dwell on this month because I think January of 2017 was really, I would argue, the pinnacle of Theresa May's time in office. It was a busy month, but probably her best month. It started by her making what became known as the Lancaster House speech, which really was intended to be the sort of definitive text on the Brexit negotiations and the approach to Brexit. And here she is making that speech all about global Britain and the kind of country we wanted to be on the other side of Brexit. So actually, it was really arguing that much as we had to go through a negotiation, the important thing, as she said at the end of the speech, was that people should look back on this time and judge us not on the decision that we made, but on what we made of that decision. And it was trying to say, let's look to the future and let's look beyond Brexit and think about the kind of country we want to create. And that originally went down very well as a speech and was well received. And when I say that, what I mean is that we were trying to bridge two sides of the Conservative Party at the time, and both sides responded well to it. But it also tested well, as we tested public opinion about it, and people welcomed that speech. But to give you a sense of the relentless nature of it, she then went from there to Davos, where she made another speech, and that was another big moment. And then immediately after that, we flew on the Prime Minister's jet to the United States, where we'd been invited to meet President Trump at the White House just a week after his inauguration. And here we are putting the finishing touches to a speech that the Prime Minister made in Philadelphia the day before the trip to the White House. And this was a speech she made to the Republican convention in Philadelphia. And it had been such a busy month. And as a speechwriter, I'd been working so flat out that as we flew into Philadelphia and came into land, I was still typing the last page of this speech out and working with Nick Timothy on it. And so here we are in the green room before she went on stage, and really this was almost the first opportunity she'd really had to study the speech in any detail. So we're just putting in the finishing touches to it here. But sometimes that's what life in Number 10 is like, because it is relentless. You never know what's going to come around the corner, and you can't always plan in advance. So you have to run to try and keep up, and that's what we were doing here.
Chris, just underlying the point there, will be a surprise to some viewers that the Prime Minister doesn't write their own speeches, but might not even, in some cases, see the actual words until they have to deliver them.
Absolutely. All Prime Ministers obviously do this differently. David Cameron had been a special advisor in government and really enjoyed the process of writing speeches. So he would often have grand meetings in his study with large teams of people to kick around ideas and drafts and things like that before a big speech. He enjoyed the process. Theresa didn't particularly enjoy the process, didn't particularly enjoy this side of the job at all. Her view always was that you should do a good job and be judged by that, and it wasn't really about kind of how you performed in public and what you said. And the consequence of that was that she was very trusting in her speechwriter, and as a speechwriter, that's a great thing, but also obviously a heavy responsibility. But I think the important thing to say is that she would always, at the start of the process, give clear guidance on what she wanted to say, and it was then my job to turn that into the language that worked for her, and she put faith in me to say it. So, you know, very much her idea is very much what she wanted to say, but the precise language came down to me. And you know, you would typically hope to present a draft rather more in advance than we were able to in Philadelphia. It was just one of those things. I'd spent ages working on Lancaster House. I then had to write a big speech for Davos, and suddenly we were heading to the United States. And so I can remember coming into land on the Prime Minister's plane. The great thing about flying on the Prime Minister's plane is there's none of this, oh, coming into land, can you put your laptop away or anything like that. That doesn't happen. So I was still able to carry on typing right up until the last minute. But yes, it's a heavy responsibility when someone sort of manages the process in that way. But as a speechwriter, rather a fantastic opportunity as well.
Very good.
Back to my point about how you can have a grand strategy, but events always get in the way. The next day we went to the White House, and here I am with a rather confused look on my face, being introduced to President Trump. And the reason I have a confused look on my face is because by this point we'd been shaking hands for about 30 seconds. I had said everything I had to say. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to say next, but it just kept going. But this was just after we had done a press conference. We'd done a meeting in the Oval Office, and then a press conference, and then we moved into a private lunch in the West Wing of the White House. And I always think this photo is sort of amusing now, because you can sort of pretty much go down certainly the US side of the table and sort of cross out most of the key figures here. You'll notice, for example, down the far end of the table is General Flynn, who was the very short-lived national security advisor at the time, who's become slightly notorious since. But a lot of these people have moved on subsequently, and obviously on the UK side of the table, I certainly have. You'll just see me poking my head out at the end. I managed to sneak into this private lunch. My point about this, though, apart from no end of stories I could tell, but probably shouldn't, about the lunch, though I may, if if President Trump isn't re-elected, I may start to tell some of those stories. But there were some certainly eye-opening moments. And basically he held court for a full hour and would just regale us with his views on a different topic for 10 minutes, and then at the end of it say, and what do you think about that, Theresa? And Theresa would offer a very diplomatic response, and then he was on to the next thing, and it was a real whirlwind of topics that he covered. But the point I wanted to make was that we went into this quite clear-eyed. We knew it would be slightly controversial going to meet the president so soon. We knew what the British public thought of him, but we had a clear objective in mind, which was, at the time, President Trump was threatening to pull the US out of NATO, and we wanted to be the people who went there and showed the UK's power by convincing him to commit the US to NATO over the long term. And indeed, Theresa persuaded him in the Oval Office meeting to do that, and then we went before the cameras in the press conference, and she basically bounced him into saying that. So there was a moment in the press conference where she said, "We have agreed that the US is committed to NATO over the long term, haven't we, Mr. President?" And he said, "Oh, yes, absolutely. Mission accomplished from our point of view." So we were very happy with this. And then we went back and retired to the UK embassy in Washington, and sat round, and we were feeling quite pleased that we'd walked this line quite carefully, and we'd achieved our objectives. And then the Prime Minister said, "Yes," she said, "he did hold my hand at one point, And we said, sorry, what? And she said, yes, he held my hand at one point. And we said, okay, did anyone get this on camera? And she said, yes. And of course, this became the front page of the following morning's papers, and all our plans about the messaging around NATO and the importance of the UK and the special relationship and our ability to influence the United States was blown out of the water by a single image, which wasn't planned in any way, but just became the story of the moment. So again, that's how difficult it is to retain your strategic focus. I'm going to just whiz through the sort of last bits of this because I think I'm sure there's some questions. I just want to bring you sort of fine up to this was March of 2017. This was the terrorist attack on Westminster Bridge, and again, this is how events intervene. When you're the Prime Minister's speechwriter and something like this happens, Number 10 goes into lockdown, the Prime Minister gets whisked into Cobra meetings, and just before they go in, somebody looks at you as a speechwriter and says, Prime Minister's going to be in this meeting for an hour. When they come out, they're going to walk out into the street and say something. They need to make a statement. Good luck. And it's your job at that moment to try and find the words for the Prime Minister to express what the nation is feeling, really, and to craft the nation's response. And that was precisely what I had to do. And it was, people often ask sort of what was the speech of which you're most proud. And actually, this and the speech that she made the following day in Parliament were probably two of the ones that I'm proudest of. But that was an event that obviously no one saw coming and that you have to respond to. And the point in Downing Street is you just never know what's going to happen next. You can be preparing to leave work at 8 o'clock at night and go home, and then something happens, it flicks up on the TV, and that's your night ruined. And again, conscious of the time, I'll just with these last few bits and pieces. But finally, to finish my story at Number 10, as it were, this was the Prime Minister signing the Article 50 letter in the Cabinet room, and obviously this was notifying the EU of our intention to withdraw from the EU permanently and kicking off that process. And originally our thinking had been to use this as the moment to announce the idea for the election. And part of the reason had been that actually we were clear, firstly, that the Prime Minister needed a stronger personal mandate for what were going to be the difficult negotiations to come. But also this was a moment for her to step out and say that actually she'd now discharged the mandate she had been given when she became Prime Minister, but if she wanted to enact the domestic policy changes that we felt Brexit also signalled people wanted, then she needed a mandate for that as well. So we did gamble on the election. We knew it was a gamble at the time, but we were confident that we had spent time developing the strategy that would get us through. And that word strategy again is important, because what then happened, and what I would argue happened, is that the moment we called the election, the Prime Minister was convinced to basically abandon the strategy that we had worked on and went in a different direction. And you remember now that the election all became about this strong and stable leadership, and our attempts had been to craft the Prime Minister as the change candidate, the person who was going to bring change to the country. And then she spent 7 weeks going around the country talking about stability and being the status quo candidate. And that's really, for me, where it started to go wrong. So I stepped away after that election. I had counselled her to call it. I take responsibility for that. I said earlier, I think it was the right thing to do. I think if we'd stuck to the strategy, we'd have got the right result. But it was that critical decision to change the strategy at that moment that I think led to what subsequently happened. Not just the failure of the election gamble, but then over the subsequent years of Theresa May's premiership, the real absence of any sense of strategy at all. Because when I left Number 10, nobody stepped into that role. And after that time, there was no director of strategy in Number 10. There was nobody owning a strategy, and I don't think there was a strategy. And that's ultimately where things went wrong for Theresa over the long term. And that brings me finally to the current day, because I think my observations on the past year are that There have certainly been some, I think, tactical missteps over the past year for Boris Johnson and his team. There have been some things that they've responded to and it's been a bit over the top, and some things that were a bit unnecessary. I think particularly the proroguing of Parliament. I think the idea of kicking some members out of the Conservative Party were probably too much and unnecessary. But I think Boris Johnson's administration have a very, very clear sense of what they're trying to do strategically. The moment effectively they walked into number 10, their clear strategy at that point was to call a general election and to win it on the basis of getting Brexit done and defeating Jeremy Corbyn. Everything they did from the day they walked into number 10 was geared towards that single-minded outcome. They delivered on that outcome. They got their election. They framed their election in the way they wanted to, and they got the right result. And for me, the way they framed the election was, as you see here, get Brexit done, but also critically this idea of unleash Britain's potential, speak to the optimism that people want you to speak to. And that was something that I think Boris Johnson does very well, and that probably Theresa May didn't do enough of. And consequently, they got the right result. This is also in the Thatcher study on the first floor of Downing Street, which is one of the best rooms to have a meeting in. And this is Boris Johnson celebrating on the night of his election victory. And I think even now, some months on, and despite everything that's happening, and obviously an absolutely unprecedented and terrible situation with coronavirus and COVID-19, I think you can still see that actually this is a government that has a really clear sense of what they are trying to do. And they don't let themselves be distracted by the day-to-day, by the noise. They always focus on the signal, which comes back to the quote I started with. They're always focused on what they're trying to do. It's about levelling up the country. It's about speaking to the people who came out and voted for the Conservative Party, maybe for the first time in December of last year. And even with everything that's going on with the virus, I think you see that starting to come through. And you see the Chancellor's statement the other day spoke to that as well. So for me, what we now have is a strategic team in Downing Street again, with a clear sense of what they're trying to do and a clear sense that they shouldn't be knocked off course by tactics or by the day-to-day machinations that can absolutely overwhelm you when you're in that building. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm sorry I've talked for so long, rather longer than I had planned, but I hope it's some useful background. But I'm delighted, obviously, to answer any questions that you might have, Anthony.
That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris, for that.
My pleasure.
And let's just go back to the picture just while we're getting some more questions in of the lunch at Downing Street.
The White House.
Sorry, I meant the White House.
Yes.
And there you can see somebody texting on the under the table on the president's side. Just explain how that works with both sides. And is that Kim Darroch on her right? See his head, who became unstuck.
Yes, indeed. So absolutely. So you see the Prime Minister there, and just out of view is Kim Darroch, who was at the time the UK ambassador to the United States, and as you say, Anthony, subsequently got into a bit of bother and was basically forced out by the new administration in Downing Street. You also see there next to him is Nick Timothy, Chief of Staff, the Prime Minister's Foreign Affairs Private Secretary at the time, Johnny Hall, Katie Perrier, who's the Director of Communications. And going the other way, you'll see Fiona Hill, who's the other Joint Chief of Staff, Mark Lyle Grant, who's National Security Advisor, and John Clark, who's the military attaché who accompanies the Prime Minister on a lot of these visits. So it was a private small lunch.
Huge competition to be there on the table amongst the staff.
Yes, completely. And I have to say, the now permanent secretary at Department of International Trade was Antonio Romeo, was initially on the list, but the political team, by which I mean the sort of special advisors of whom I was one, sort of pulled rank and made sure that we were able to outnumber the officials there.
Still hasn't forgiven you, Chris. And did you steal a napkin from the White House?
We all very uncoolly stole the name cards and the menu cards that you can see there as well. And so I have them hanging on my wall at home as a memento of that visit.
Okay, let's come straight on to the questions now. And thank you very much, everybody, for sending them in. Dave, a rather cheeky question from Dave here says, how did you become such a good speechwriter? And Dave tells us that I'm getting married. Congratulations, Dave, by the way. And would you be able to write my speech or give me some tips? There you are. Dave, they are a cheeky lot, the Buckingham people.
Well, I mean,
so
really...
what are the secrets of a good speech?
Yeah, I mean, it's I mean, just on the first point, really good question, because it gives me the chance to say that I always say that the reason I stumbled into speechwriting really, but the reason I found that I had an aptitude for it was because I had a solid musical training when I was growing up, and I think music helps enormously, because speechwriting is all about rhythm and cadence and nuance and things like that, and that's what music teaches you. So I'm going to fly the flag for good music education. But what's the secret of a good speech? So I would say it's about understanding the context in which you're speaking. So what are the audience thinking when you stand up? What's their attitude to you, and how can you then develop a connection with them? So start by revealing something or telling a story or something that brings them onto your side, that helps you to develop that connection immediately. So it's about context, it's about that connection, and then it's about having a good, strong content. And obviously that's depending on your topic, you need substance behind all of those things. And then it's about individual techniques. So the one that speechwriters will always talk about, and quite famously, is the sort of rule of three. So if you look at, my wife always says you can tell a speech that I've written for somebody because in the sort of first page or 2 pages there will be a moment where the speaker lists 3 things in a row, and that rule of 3 is the thing that grabs people's attention, and it's sort of well proven that the human mind can cope with 3 concepts and no more, but 3 resonates with people. So always stick to that as well. So I think for your wedding speech, find something you can talk about with that rule of 3, and that will be a way of getting people on board.
And did you write your own wedding speech, and was it a real wow, Chris?
I did write my wedding speech, and I loved it, I have to say. And it was a long time ago, Anthony, but I can still remember it pretty much word for word. I mean, I'll tell you what my opening joke was, but Dave, I don't know about your situation, Dave, but my wife is about 5 foot tall. So I stood up and I said, I know many of you will be anticipating a great speech, but normally I write them for other people and don't deliver them myself. In fact, I asked somebody for some advice about what to do, and they said, Chris, just 2 words, short and snappy. And I said, yes, that's the wife. Now what about the speech? And people like that, and it seemed to bring them on side. So a good joke always helps.
And you're still married all these years later, so it was obviously very good. Jen says, Chris, wow, fantastic pictures. I didn't realize how big number 10 is. It looks so small on TV. And she's asking whether you worked with Kate Fall, who spoke to us about a month ago and showed slides, and maybe just comment there on the wisdom or otherwise of the distancing of Theresa May from David Cameron and his team. Yes,
very, very interesting, very interesting. So I worked with Kate only in the sense that I was a special advisor in the Department for Education when David Cameron was in office. So I certainly sort of crossed paths with Kate then when she was in Downing Street, but we didn't work closely together. I think it's fair to say, but we certainly know each other. And she was actually she was a fantastic deputy chief of staff for David. But yeah, it's a really interesting point. I think every prime minister basically decides they want to define themselves against their predecessor, and it was really a serious decision that we made that Theresa was going to be different, and she wanted to define herself slightly against David Cameron. The shift, for example, as I alluded to earlier, away from this idea of sofa government, it's all very chummy, it's all very sort of relaxed. If you remember, there was this thing about David Cameron chillaxing all the time. The shift away from that to this more grown-up sort of cabinet style of government, and the fact that she put the table and chairs in her study was seen as symbolic of that. But also she had a perspective on the Brexit referendum result, which said that actually, yes, this was a vote about leaving Europe, but actually it was also a revolt against the status quo, and it was a revolt against a sort of type of politician, really, who had spent too long sort of worrying what Westminster thought and not enough thinking about what the country thought. And she felt that really quite strongly, and brutally, David Cameron would be in that bracket, and so she did want to define herself very clearly against him. I think it was the right thing to do strategically, but it went too far. And one of the problems with Theresa May's premiership was it almost basically got off on the wrong foot on day one. One of the things she did was she quite brutally dismissed George Osborne from the cabinet. He'd been the Chancellor for a number of years. He was very well regarded. But she not only didn't find a place for him in her cabinet, but there was then a lot of media briefing about the way it had been done. And if I'm honest, that comes to the sort of enmity between George Osborne and other members of Theresa's staff, not me, I rather like George. But that briefing and the way it was done really, basically stored up trouble for the future. And on election night in 2017, when it was going wrong, George Osborne was famously on ITV News when the exit poll came in, and having been booked for half an hour, he stayed for the entire night to comment on the result. And he took his revenge. And if you treat people that way, it's kind of okay when the times are good, but when they're bad, you find you have no friends left.
Important lesson for everybody. And describe that next day, which you've spoken to me about often before, Chris, on the Friday, the day after the general election, how she was on that day when you went back in.
Yes, I mean, firstly, everybody was absolutely sort of, well, I was going to say shattered, but shattered by which I mean tired. I mean, none of us had slept for 48 hours or so. So you're trying to make decisions, big decisions, very quickly on basically no sleep. So that's a problem. But Theresa was absolutely shell-shocked. She had been led to believe, even though we knew the campaign had been pretty awful, we knew there'd been missteps. Let's say the strategy was junked at the start of it, we went in a different direction, that was the wrong decision. We knew it had all gone wrong, but still, through to the very end, the message back from the campaign team had been that the numbers on the ground were fine, and indeed at 9 o'clock on election night, the reports were that we expected a majority of somewhere around 60. So when the exit poll dropped at 10 o'clock, I will never forget that moment. It was just an absolute shock, complete shell shock. For me, it quickly turned to anger, because I was really angry at the way the campaign had been conducted, the fact the strategy had been changed. It hadn't been what we'd wanted at all. But Theresa was just completely shell shocked. It wasn't what she was expecting, it wasn't what she'd been led to believe. She was angry. But then she had to make some very quick decisions. And she famously made a speech that day in Downing Street, which sort of made the situation worse because it was rather ill-judged.
Not written by you, written by the civil servants.
But yes, written by the civil service. But the reason for that was because the civil service said the most important thing now, we're in the middle of these Brexit negotiations, is that Brussels needs to know that we have a functioning government, because they will take advantage of anything that they see as a vacuum. And so the speech was not really intended for the British people. It wasn't really intended for the Parliamentary Conservative Party. It was a message to Brussels about the fact that we had a Prime Minister and we were ploughing on. But it did backfire on her politically.
How is she feeling now? Does she feel her premiership was a failure? And we've got lots more questions.
I mean, I think she certainly feels, well, she feels that she tried her absolute best, and she really did. She gave it everything. I think she feels slightly let down by certain members of the Parliamentary Conservative Party, but she's too loyal a Conservative, somebody who's been steeped in the party for years, to probably say that publicly. But I do think she feels that she just didn't ever have the opportunity to deliver on her wider agenda. And that, for me, is the shame of it. Interestingly, Theresa's never been somebody who's particularly motivated by Europe. Brexit was not something that she was particularly animated by, but she wanted to be Prime Minister because she had things she wanted to do. Domestic reforms, things like championing the cause of domestic violence, the work she's done around modern slavery, these kind of things. I once said to her, what is it that you really want to do? What do you want to be remembered for? And she said, I want to be the Prime Minister who gives a voice to people who feel they don't have a voice. So there's a really strong, potentially powerful narrative there and powerful agenda, and she just never got to deliver it because of Brexit. And I think she feels very regretful about that.
You never get a second chance, do you, in that job? Bex rather cheekily said, if you got the call tomorrow, would you go back into number 10?
I think that really would be grounds for divorce if I did that, because working in politics is really not conducive to a good family life. To be serious though, I wouldn't, to be honest. I happen in the job I do now to do some work with number 10 and with the Prime Minister anyway, and I think that puts me in a sort of great position because I'm sort of not in it, but I'm close enough to it. I still love politics, and it's a great thing to work in. But I've done my time, and it was difficult after the 2017 election. I had to decide whether to stay or to go, and I looked at it and I said, well, I've done a year here. I've done pretty much everything I could ever hope to do. I have been for lunch with the US president at the White House. What else can there be? So I do feel I've done my time now. I had some great experiences, and I'll support from the outside. But I think I'm done for frontline politics.
And a local question here from Adam about John Bercow, the former
yes.
Chris, hero or villain? That's going to give you a quick choice there.
I think, if I'm honest, I think ultimately John probably overstepped the mark in too many ways in that role and lost his neutrality that you expect in that role. I like John. I actually used to work for him when he was on the Shadow Home Office team when I worked for Anne Widdecombe. I took the vehicle licensing bill through Parliament with John Bercow, which is a great part of my career. So I know him quite well, but I do think he lost his objectivity and his impartiality, and I think that's ultimately probably damaging for the institution of the House of Commons.
And two single answer questions here. Hongbo says, are there secret tunnels from under number 10 to the House of Commons?
Not to the House of Commons. There are, however, nuclear bunkers under the Ministry of Defence, which you can get to from number 10, and you quickly find out where you are in the pecking order in number 10 by which one you're allocated to when you have your initial security briefing.
And for you, Chris?
And I was in the one with the PM, so that was rather nice.
Elizabeth says, is there the move to the switch in the briefings, making them public, good or bad?
I think this is a good thing. I wrote a piece yesterday about the changes the government wants to make to the comms setup generally, and I'm supportive of them in general. But I do actually think it's a good thing. The lobby is a very strange thing. Where you have people sort of off camera just talking to journalists and then being quoted as though they are the Prime Minister. And I think that's a rather strange setup in this day and age. So I think some transparency and shining some light on the process.
And this really is a one-word answer now. In 5 years' time, will Boris or Starmer be in number 10?
Possibly neither.
Thank you. That's 2 words. And now our equivalent here on these fireside University of Buckingham talks of Desert Island Discs. You mentioned music. What's your piece of music you're going to take with you?
Oh gosh, there's a question. I am a big fan of a singer-songwriter called Martin Joseph, who's a Welsh singer-songwriter. So I would probably take "Please Sir" by Martin Joseph.
Please, Sir by Martin Joseph on the tip of everyone's tongue. And Chris, we're not going to allow you a book. You're going to have to choose which of those leaders that you've worked for, the 5 that you put up, would you like to take on to a desert island with you?
Oh wow, gosh. Indeed. Do you know what? I think actually the first of those, William Hague, was he was leader too soon. He'd have been a brilliant prime minister, and he's a really very good man. So that would be rather fun.
There you are. So you've got William Hague and Please listening to all the time. And Chris Wilkins, you have given us a fantastic talk. Thank you so much. The pictures worked really well. Thank you everyone for the questions. Chris, from all of us here, and we think it's gone up to 1,700 listening. As I said, do share the talks, please, with everybody. Tomorrow night, we've got Andrew Adonis talking about his new book on Ernest Bevin, Britain's greatest foreign secretary, quite possibly. Next week, we've got Rory Stewart talking, and Kim Ledbetter, who's the sister of Joe Cox, murdered during the referendum campaign, talking about Joe Cox and the work of the Joe Cox Foundation, amongst others. Chris Wilkins, from all of us, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you all.